Thank you very much for joining. My Rebbe had a tattoo. It's not something you usually hear. And if a Rav has a tattoo, so it's not something that they usually talk about. For my Rebbe, his tattoo was a central part of his story and who he was. Rabbi Sinai Adler, Hariny, Keferet, Mischbó, was a Torah scholar. He was an inspiring personality and an Eved Hashem. He was also a Holocaust survivor, and his experiences as a 16-year-old in a ghetto, multiple concentration camps, a death march, and the trauma they produced turned Rabbi Sinai and transformed him into the person who he was. Rabbi Sinai was dedicated to Torah. He was the personification of emunah and bitachon, of faith and trust, and no matter what went on in his life, he believed that you should serve Hashem with passion, enthusiasm, and happiness, simcha. It's who he was. I actually wrote this eulogy 2 years ago, as odd as that might sound. There was a seminary in Yerushalayim that asked if I could speak about Rabbi Sinai. They had a series of speakers that came in and talked about their rebbeim. And Rabbi Sinai and I always, there was no subject that we couldn't broach. And I sat with Rabbi Sinai after one of our chavrusas and said that I had been asked to speak about him and our relationship. And asked if he had anything that he would want me to mention, anything he'd want me to say. We both knew what the conversation actually was. We both understood that we were writing his eulogy. And parts of this Hesped, this eulogy that I'm giving now, come from that talk. And so in a way, this is sort of what maybe Rabbi Sinai wanted everyone to know about him and his life. In this eulogy, I'd like to give you a picture of who Rabbi Sinai was, what he stood for, the lessons that he taught, and end with my relationship with him and what I gained from him. I want to start with Rabbi Sinai's life. He was born in Prague in Czechoslovakia in 1928. His father was a unique individual. He was a Rav with a PhD. He was the Rav of the shul across the street from the Altanoi shul in Prague. Today, it's a JCC, and as you walk in, Rabbi Sinai's father's picture is hanging in it. The Czech government was so appreciative of who Rabbi Sinai's father was that about 20 years ago they opened a museum in his memory and produced a coin in commemoration of the opening of that museum. In March 1939, Czechoslovakia was annexed by Germany. The Germans immediately denied human rights to the Jews. Rabbi Sinai was thrown out of his school. He attended a public school, and they couldn't use public transportation. The Jews had to hand over their valuable possessions, and almost immediately the deportations began. Rabbi Sinai switched to a Jewish school, and when he was brought to the ghetto, the Jewish school continued in the ghetto until it was closed in 1942. When Rabbi Sinai was finished with 8th grade, that was the end of his formal education until he would enter yeshiva years later. It was on Parshas Pinchas that Rabbi Sinai, with the shuls closed, celebrated his bar mitzvah. 79 years later, he died on that same Shabbat, this past Shabbos. In March 1943, Rabbi Sinai's family was deported to the Theresienstadt ghetto. While Theresienstadt had only a few thousand residents before it was turned into a ghetto, there were now tens of thousands of Jews crowded into these few streets. The people worked jobs, but still almost starved to death on the non-kosher food provided to them. The Germans told them that they would just be staying there until the storm passed. In May 1943, Rabbi Sinai's father had fallen ill, and they were ordered for a transport. At this point, they knew what that meant. They were sent in a cattle car with 58 people to Auschwitz. That cattle car rode on Shabbat, and on the train, Rabbi Sinai's father made kiddush for everybody. They were quickly sent to Birkenau. In the beginning, there was no work. They just sat, so he actually studied Bava Kama. On July 19th, after his selection, Rabbi Sinai's parents celebrated their silver wedding anniversary in Auschwitz. Rabbi Sinai was transferred and had only a few minutes to say goodbye to his parents, all of them knowing that this would be the last time they would see each other. Rabbi Sinai had had the opportunity, or his parents had had the opportunity, to send him away before the Holocaust had begun. and his mother, nervous as to what that would entail, had not sent him. One of the last things that Rabbi Sinai's mother said to her son was an apology for not sending him out sooner. Rabbi Sinai met a Gentile inside this camp that looked out for him. And along with some relative easy jobs, Rabbi Sinai earned extra food. He even built a sukkah while he was in Auschwitz, celebrated Hanukkah, and had at his Pesach Seder in Auschwitz read the Haggadah. They were then moved to the Plavlai concentration camp. The Russians were coming, and on August 17, 1945, they were moved all over Poland and Czechoslovakia. On the death march, they landed in Mauthausen. He made a vow to Hashem that if he survived the Holocaust, he would dedicate his life to Torah study. He was liberated by the Americans, moved around, and was sent eventually to England 3 years to the date of his arrival in the ghetto. After 6 months in England studying under Rav Abramsky, he finally got entrance from his brother who had come to Israel before the Holocaust and had sent a ticket for him to come to Israel. He made it to Israel, and immediately, when I say immediately, I don't mean it within a couple of weeks, but within 1 day of arriving in Israel, he began Yeshivas Hebron, signed up for Yeshivas Hebron, where he was behind all the other Talmidim who had been in Yerushalayim throughout the entire Holocaust. Sinai arrived late, didn't have the background that the rest of the Talmidim had, but the Rosh Hashiva told the other Talmidim to help him along, and eventually he caught up. After a couple of years, he married Rav Charlap's granddaughter and got a job at Nativ Meir at a high school opening up that Elul. But Rav Goldlicht, Zechron Tzadik Avracha, had just opened up Karen B'Yavna, and his wife had fallen ill, and they needed a Rebbe. And Rav Sinai, who had promised his first wife that they would never leave Yerushalayim, made his way to Karen B'Yavna, where he was a Rebbe, the first Rebbe at Karen B'Yavna, for 7 years. After 7 years, the state of Israel decided to open up a new city called Ashdod, with a new port. And this new city needed a Rav. Yavna is not so far from Ashdod. Rav Sinai's reputation preceded him, and he became the first chief rabbi of Ashdod, where he stayed for 22 years. While in Ashdod, him and his wife built a kehillah, built many, many shuls. Gedolei Torah came to Ashdod to live. And after 22 years of being in Ashdod as a chief rabbi, unfortunately, his first wife fell ill with cancer. She passed away, and that was it with Rav Sinai with the rabbinate. He could not handle it without his rebbitzin, and he retired from the rabbinate and moved to the Vasar Tzion, where his Talmidim, from his first year at Karen B'Yavna, opened up a kollel. He decided to join as a Rebbe in the kollel. That's where he spent his remaining 40 years of his life, as a Rebbe teaching Talmidim in the kollel Meretz. Rav Sinai passed away with over 300 direct descendants. He had 4 children, 3 daughters, and a son. They each had, on average, if not more than 10 children, and it goes on and on. He remarried during his lifetime to Rebbitzin Devora, who was the only Rebbitzin that I met, and he lived with her for 26 years. He authored over 10 Sfarim. Rav Sinai maintained, in probably the most well-known sefer that he wrote, Begates al Maves, in English, Your Rod and Your Staff, that the Holocaust was a punishment from Hashem, an incredibly controversial position that I nor anybody else who had not gone through the fires of the Holocaust could not take. And even he was reticent to take that position without speaking to no less than 3 Torah giants of his generation to ask if he could say such a thing. And they said yes. He felt that when the nation as a whole does not follow the Torah, the nation as a whole gets punished. And swept in with the guilty people are the innocents. I remember one time during the reading of the Tochacha, which we'll speak about soon, the custom throughout the world is that the Tochacha is read silently. The Baal Koreh reads it, this section of the Torah that has the curses and the punishments of what happens when we don't follow the Torah. We generally read it in a lower tone. Rav Sinai would scream and yell that it has to be read at full volume. because he said that the first time it was read, we didn't listen, and then we had the Holocaust. We must pay attention when that section of the Torah is read, and it must be loud so we don't repeat our mistakes. The first time I met Rabbi Sinai, well, I was 18, and Rabbi Michael Citrin from the Meretz Kollel organized a talk that Rabbi Sinai was going to give to the American students that shared a campus with the Kollel Meretz in Yeshiva Shari Mevaseret Zion. And the speech was going to be about his everything that happened to him in the Holocaust and the lessons from the Holocaust. And I didn't speak Hebrew that well. I didn't understand Hebrew that well. And I was a little nervous about attending this talk and whether I'd be able to understand it. Rabbi Citrin said, don't worry, he would translate for us. And 15 of us crowded into Rabbi Sinai's study. Rabbi Sinai sat there, and I understood maybe a third of the words, but I felt I was missing the point, because Rabbi Sinai was supposed to be speaking about the Holocaust, and yet he was smiling the entire time. He spoke about saying goodbye to his parents with a smile on his face. He talked about the death of his parents with a smile on his face, the selection with a smile on his face. And I said, I must be missing something, because why would you smile when talking about such horrors of the Holocaust? And once you got to know Rav Sinai, once you understood that what he really stood for was the pasuk Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha, to serve God with joy. And that's what Rav Sinai was all about. And one of the things, I remember I talked to his son this morning, I paid a shiva call, and his son asked me how I was. And I said, Baruch Hashem, not good. And we both laughed, because if Rav Sinai asked you how you were, and you just gave the common answer, Baruch Hashem, he would say, Lo maspik, that's not enough. Baruch Hashem what? Because we bless Hashem for the good, and we bless Hashem equally for the bad. And therefore, it doesn't make a difference if things are good in your life or bad in your life. You need to smile. You need to serve Hashem with simcha. When he talked about the hardships of his life, it didn't make a difference. If he talked about the passing of his first wife and how painful that was for him, or the passing of his second wife, or how lonely he was living alone for the last 10 years of his life, it was all with a smile. And if you spent Simchas Torah in Mivaseret Zion, you cannot forget how Rav Sinai would outdance us all around the bima, clapping on the bima with a huge grin on his face, singing Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha. It's an image that you just cannot forget. As I said, Rav Sinai felt that the Holocaust was a punishment for Hashem, and he pointed to the part of, and I can't stress enough how much of a part of Rav Sinai's life that was, to understand and put into context the Holocaust. It wasn't something that happened to him. It wasn't something that was a historical event. It wasn't something that we just had to remember. It was something that we had to understand and put into context of the philosophy and the hashkafa of the Torah. And for him, he pointed to this section of the Torah that talked about the punishments of the Torah. And he said that this section of the Torah came true during the Holocaust. Every single punishment listed happened during those years in Europe. And he said, if you look inside the Torah, what it says, it doesn't say that if you don't follow the mitzvos, these punishments will happen to you. It doesn't say if you're not careful about halacha, then these punishments will happen to you. It says if you do the mitzvos, but don't do them b'simcha u'v'tov levav, if you don't do them with passion, with enthusiasm, with joy, that's what brings the punishment. Many see Torah as a burden or an obligation. I have to do this. I have to keep Shabbat. I have to daven now. Now's the time where I have to go daven. But if you take that approach, you'll never fulfill mitzvos with the passion and enthusiasm and joy that they're designed to have. And Rav Sinai embodied that. He showed what that meant. The next lesson I learned from Rav Sinai is Emunah and Bitachon. He wrote this book, and and I'm sure many of you who have not come into contact or read Rav Sinai's book are quite shocked to hear how he felt that the Holocaust was a punishment, and felt that it was a punishment from God for the Jews not following the Torah with joy. But Rav Sinai saw that as the greatest demonstration and proof that God exists. He could not understand the question when people would say, how can you have faith, emunah, after going through the Holocaust, after seeing what you saw? He could not understand that question. It simply boggled his mind. He said, look in the Torah. It says, if you don't follow the mitzvos with joy, then you will have these punishments. And we didn't follow the mitzvos with joy, and we had these punishments. What could be a greater proof of God's existence than his word coming true? For Rabbi Sinai, the Holocaust was the ultimate proof of God's existence. Rabbi Sinai tells stories of how he would learn in Auschwitz. He was only 16. He didn't come from a background that was where he was learning as a teenager or as a preteen, was when he entered the ghetto. But one night, late at night in Auschwitz, and he loved telling this story, especially to people in yeshiva. He talked about how one night the Nazis told everybody that they were going to delouse themselves and their clothing. And they had everybody strip, and it was a freezing January night. And they had everybody strip and walk into a room, and they understood what might be happening at that point, and they sprayed them with a chemical to get the lice off of them, and they put their clothes in certain machines that sprayed chemicals that deloused the clothing. And when they got out of the showers from the treatment, they found out that the machine had broken and their clothes weren't ready, and they were sent back in a freezing January night. They were sent back to their bunks, naked, freezing. And on the bunks were blankets. That's all they had to cover themselves. On a freezing cold Poland night in Auschwitz. And Rabbi Sinai got onto his bunk, and people were freezing to death. And they knew that this could be it for them. And a man lying down next to Rabbi Sinai said to him, if we don't combine our body heats, we're going to die. We need to lie down and lie together so that our body heat keeps us both alive. And they scrunched together, put one blanket over both of them. And the man said to Rabbi Sinai, he said, I need to tell you something. Every night before I go to sleep, it's very important. The Torah tells us that we have to set a time every day and every night to study Torah. And in Auschwitz, this man who memorized Maseches Beitzah learned with Rabbi Sinai. And they went over Maseches Beitzah at night together on that freezing cold night. Rabbi Sinai would talk about the impression that had on him, how important learning Torah was, that even in Auschwitz, when for sure this man was exempt from learning Torah, it was so important to him that every night he had a time to study Torah. Rabbi Sinai talked about the pasuk. I wrote about this week. One of the most famous things that he would say this Dvar Torah over and over. I must have heard it over 100 times from him. The pasuk says, Kaveh el Hashem chazak v'yamatzu kaveh el Hashem. The pasuk says, have faith, have hope in Hashem, strengthen yourself, and then have hope in Hashem again. And a man approached Rabbi Sinai. They were walking in the snow with just their thin garments. And a man walked up to Rabbi Sinai and said to him, this is during the Holocaust. Why the repetition? Kaveh el Hashem, chazak v'yamatzu kaveh el Hashem. Why does it say that phrase, Kaveh el Hashem, again? And he said that at times you tell yourself you have to have faith in Hashem, and then something happens. Something bad happens to you. And you start losing that faith. Chazak v'yamatz, Rabbi Sinai would say. He would bang on the table and say, Chazak v'yamatz, strengthen yourself. Kaveh el Hashem, and then have faith in Hashem. And that was a Dvar Torah that he learned in Auschwitz, that he heard in Auschwitz or on the death march, and he never forgot it. And he would say it to people over and over. Rabbi Sinai felt that God's presence was in our lives at all times, and we must lead our life with that awareness. The last lesson is Rabbi Sinai, his dedication to Torah. Rabbi Sinai and to mitzvos. Rabbi Sinai davened, as we know, at Hanetz every single morning. And when I say every single morning, I mean every single morning. And there's a halacha. This was something that had an impression on me that I can never forget this. There's a halacha that if you daven at Hanetz every single morning and the sunrise, if you match your Shemon Esrei to the sunrise every single morning, then it's preferable for you at times to daven by yourself at Hanetz than at a minyan later in the morning. That's a halacha. But the only people that can really claim that halacha are people who daven hanitz regularly. One morning, Rabbi Sinai's alarm, over the course of 40 years, at some point your battery is going to run out. Rabbi Sinai's alarm battery ran out, and he came late to davening. He missed hanitz. I told this story to his family, and they said they don't believe it because alarms, no alarms, but I know it. Rabbi Sinai told it to me. And Rabbi Sinai was so worried that he missed one day, and that got him out of the status of being someone who regularly davens at hanitz. And he felt that now he lost the status because one day by accident he overslept. And he called Rabbi Yashiv to make sure. Rabbi Yashiv told him he doesn't have to worry. He's still considered somebody who regularly davens hanitz. One thing I saw this year that I never saw before, and I talked to Rabbi Sinai's son-in-law about this, and we both said we couldn't remember one time, not one time, seeing Rabbi Sinai sit on his couch. He has in his living room, he has a set of couches like everybody has around a small table. And Rabbi Sinai would sit at his dining room table or his kitchen table and eat his meals. And then he would go into his study or he would go into the bedroom. That was it. He never relaxed. Rabbi Sinai's son-in-law told me how he would at the end of the meal, everybody that came for Shabbat would relax on the couches except for Rabbi Sinai. If he was awake and he had strength, he was learning. And that was it. He learned, he taught, and he wrote. That's all he used to do. And I remember every Bein Hazmanim, he would go on vacation with his wife to his brother's apartment in Tzfat. But as soon as his wife passed away, the vacation stopped. There was no reason to go on vacation anymore. It was just learning. He felt Torah was your lifeblood. Ki heim chayinu, he would tell us. He said you can't live without Torah. Just as the soul is nourished, as the body is nourished with food and drink, the soul is nourished with Torah. In my life, in this room, when I sit here and I study Torah, I have pictures of Rabbi Sinai on this wall and on that wall. And I always think to myself, what if there's ever a time where I start drifting away from my learning? I picture Rabbi Sinai and how much he loved his learning. I picture his loud Shema. I picture his singing when he learned. He learned with a tune to it, something that I'll never forget. He would teach me whenever he had the chance. His dedication stands as an example to me in my life. I'd like to take a few minutes just to discuss my relationship with Rabbi Sinai and hopefully give some kavod in that sense. I met Rabbi Sinai, as I told you, in that first speech that he gave to the Americans, and I was drawn to him, I was taken to him by that smile, and I couldn't understand it, and I said, that's somebody who I wanted to connect to. But I was in the American yeshiva, Rabbi Sinai taught in the Israeli kollel. There was no real connection. There was no reason why he would have anything to do with me or I would have anything to do with him. So there was no vehicle. There was no apparatus that I could use to be able to make a connection with him. But I decided that what I was going to do was, every single time he left the base medrash, I would come up with some question. Didn't matter if I knew the answer, didn't know the answer, and wanted to know the answer, didn't want to know the answer, but I wanted to have a question that I could ask him so I could walk with him back to his house. And every day, I would walk him back to his house and ask him a question. After about 2 or 3 weeks of doing this, and my broken Hebrew and his broken English and trying to connect somehow together and understanding his answers, he turned to me and said that his book was translated, his book about the Holocaust was translated into English. And he needed somebody to sell it to the Americans. So being the wise guy that I am, I said to him, I'll sell it on one condition. I want something in return. I'll be working for you. So Rabbi Sinai looked at me, gasped that I would have the chutzpah and the temerity to say such a thing. And he said, well, there's no real money to be made here. I'm not really selling it for a profit. I'm not gonna have a percentage to be able to give to you. And I said, no, I'm not interested in money. I want an invite to your Shabbos table. And that week, he invited me and my friend, Rabbi Tavi Kozlo, to his Shabbos table. And that's when the relationship started. By my second year, I was learning with Rabbi Sinai once a week and coming to his house almost every day with some sort of gimmick and question I had to ask him. And at my end of my second year, Rabbi Sinai visited America, and I took him with my father to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. My parents and I took him to the Statue of Liberty. Those are different stories. And by my third year, I was learning with him morning Seder. We learned probably, I still to this day cannot understand why he put me through this. We learned Maseches Kelim. And for those that know what Maseches Kelim is, you're probably just as shocked as I am that we spent an entire morning. It was probably the hardest learning I've ever done. I became a Ben Bayit in his house. Rabbi Sinai looked at me as a son. He would frequently and awkwardly in front of his children call me his son, in front of his grandchildren call me his son, and that was considered a part of his family. When his wife passed away, it was on a Shabbos in Yerushalayim. I was living in Los Angeles at the time, and my father called right when Havdalah hits, and that's never, ever a good time to get a phone call. And my father told me that the Rebbitzin had passed away. Well, this Rebbitzin who had fed me, who had cared for me, who had taken Eliza in when we got married, and I immediately grabbed my passport, and Eliza drove me to the airport. I don't think I packed a bag, and just went up to the halal counter and said, get me to Israel as fast as possible. We went straight from the airport to Rabbi Sinai's house, and I sat, while he sat shiva, I sat with him. I was there for a couple of days and then flew back. When we finally were able to move back to Israel 6 years ago today is Rabbi Sinai's 92nd birthday, the 24th of Tammuz. When I moved back to Israel, I was able to learn with him sometimes twice a week, sometimes once a week. The Shulchan Aruch maintains that you tear kriya for your Rebbe Muvhak. A Rebbe Muvhak is not just somebody that you learn Torah from. Rebbe Muvhak is the person that taught you Rov Chachmasa, the majority of your Torah learning. Soloveitchik explained that it's not the person that teaches you the most Dapei Gemara, but the person that's had the greatest impression on you in your lifetime. And this past Saturday night, I tore kriya at his funeral. It was the first time, other than over Yerushalayim, but over a person that I've had to tear kriya. The Piskei Tshuva in Yoredeya says that a convert must also tear kriya when the person who helped them convert dies as well. And it's similar, this idea of the person that taught you Torah and ripping your shirt over them in mourning when they pass away. It reminds me of Avram Avinu. When it says that Nefesh Asu B'Charan, the souls that Avram made were the people that Avram taught about ethical monotheism. And he brought them Tachas Kanfei HaShechina. He brought them under the wings of Hashem. And that's what somebody who helps a non-Jew convert, they do the exact same thing. It reminds me of the difference that the Mishnah and Bava Metzia talks about, the difference between a Rebbe and parents. When discussing whose lost object you return first, if you find in a weird circumstance your parents' lost object and your Rebbe's lost object, you return your Rebbe's lost object first. Because your parents brought you to this world, but your Rebbe brings you to Olam Haba. And so the Ibn Ezra, when it says Elet Toldos, and it talks about how Avram holy this Yitzchak, and it repeats the phrase twice, that Avram gave birth or raised Yitzchak. The Ibn Ezra explains that when somebody teaches somebody else Torah and mitzvos, it's as if they birthed them. It's as if they were molid them. And that's what a Rebbe Muvhak is. Rabbi Sinai was my Rebbe Muvhak. It was as if he raised me. But where does a Rebbe get the desire to teach somebody else? Why does a Rebbe work so hard to teach somebody else? A Rebbe's not obligated to do this. Rabbi Sinai wasn't assigned as a student. He wasn't assigned me as a student. He welcomed me into his home. So what drove him to do this? What drives teachers to teach their students? What drives Rebbeim to put in so much effort, so much more than what their obligations are for their students? And the Rambam talks about in the Sefer HaMitzvos, the mitzvah of Ahavas Hashem. And he talks about how somebody that has true love of Hashem, the love is like a cup that overflows. The Torah goes in and goes in and goes in and goes in. At a certain point, the Rebbe is full. And as he learns more Torah, it overflows. And he has to teach. If you love something, you're going to show it to other people. When somebody gets engaged, they tell the whole world about the gem that they found. That's what somebody that has Avas Hashem, they have to tell the world about how special Kadosh Baruch Hu is. And that's what Rabbi Sinai did. Rabbi Sinai went around like Avram Avinu, who had this Avas Hashem, and he just had to tell people. A parent raises their child because there's an instinctual drive that all of us have to raise our children. We're born with that drive. It's natural. It's a part of us. Animals have it and humans have it as well. But a Rebbe's love for their students comes from their love of Hashem. It's that overflowing. Rabbi Sinai was a man who truly loved God and Torah. And that love overflowed to all those around him. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avos tells us twice, Aseh lech Rav. Pick yourself a Rav. Find a Rav that will teach you a Derech HaChaim, a Derech HaTorah, a path in the Torah, a path in life, and will also teach you how to get around doubts and questions that you have in halacha, and they'll answer those questions. But how does a person pick a Rebbe? How does a person choose a Rebbe? How does a person choose? Who does he go to? How does he know who his Rebbe should be? And the Gemara says that if you meet a Talmid Chacham who reminds you of a Malach Hashem Tzvakos, an angel of God, pick that person as your Rebbe. The problem is that none of us have ever seen an angel of God. So how are we supposed to know who to pick? And the answer is, it's our image. Our image of an angel of God, of a Malach, is someone who is completely dedicated to the service of God, who does not do anything else but their avodas Hashem, who can be described as the Eved Hashem. That was what Rabbi Sinai was to so many of us. I'm grateful for the 25 years that I had with Rabbi Sinai. This day, the day that I would have to give this eulogy, was a day that I dreaded for years. I knew that it was coming. At some point, I knew it. As I said, Rabbi Sinai told everybody, including his own children, that I was like a son to him. And I've received many calls, and I'm so grateful to all those that have called me this week and have expressed their condolences and knew the pain that I was in and said that they were with me, and I appreciate it. The calls that I appreciated the most were the ones that I least expected. They were from my students who had heard about Rabbi Sinai from me. And from my students, whether from 15 years ago in Eulogy in Los Angeles, who I set up a Skype session with Rabbi Sinai, and they heard from Rabbi Sinai all the way in Los Angeles, or Rabbi Sinai sat in my parents' apartment in Mevaseret, trying to figure out where he should look in the camera. This is before Corona and Zoom, and everybody knew what they were doing. To students from only a couple of years ago in Migdal Torah and Modi'in, who I took to Rabbi Sinai, and those students called me and wrote to me and texted me, thanking me so much for that one opportunity they had to meet Rabbi Sinai and how they never forgot it. That was the impression that Rabbi Sinai left. The first 3 days after Rabbi Sinai passed away, I felt just so alone without him. But now that time has moved on, the feeling is no longer of loneliness. It's a feeling of regret. It's a feeling of a desire. If I could just have a few more minutes, I would discuss with Rabbi Sinai every single issue that I had. There was nothing that I was embarrassed to speak to him about. There was nothing that I felt he couldn't relate to. As a 60-year-old when I met him, a 70-year-old, an 80-year-old, as a 90-year-old, there was nothing that I felt I couldn't say to him that he couldn't relate to. And I really wish I could call him and ask him how to handle today, how to handle life without him. Rabbi Sinai was a Talmid Chacham who simply served God at every single moment. He will forever be the model of love and dedication for me. If I would sum up our relationship in just a couple of words, it would be Ani l'dodi, l'dodi li. Thank you so much for being here with me.